British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has called on G7 leaders to sign up to a plan on climate change and help developing countries decarbonise their economies. The first in-person meeting of the leaders of major developed economies for nearly 2 years will take place in Cornwall, in the southwestern part of England. The leaders of the United States, Japan, Germany, the United Kingdom, France, Canada and Italy are all expected to pledge slowing climate change, and Johnson wants that the G7 to support large-scale renewable energy projects across Africa and parts of Asia. Joining us now is Happy Kambula, who's the Senior Climate and Energy Campaign Manager at Greenpeace Africa. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Always good to talk to you.
Good evening and good evening to all the viewers. And yes, it's been a while and I'm excited about the conversation today.
All right. So are you excited about the G7 talking about climate?
Well, what we're looking forward to is the main talking points, which would be the 4 priority areas which the G7 needs to be talking about, and climate is one of them. But we cannot run away from the fact that we still need to discuss the unequal rollout of the vaccine across the globe. But climate change, particularly climate finance, is going to be a big talking point.
What needs to be agreed upon? I suppose a change in the White House has helped a great deal, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the first step was that within the first few days, the President of the United States, the new president being Joe Biden, basically said, look, the United States is coming back into the Paris Agreement and will be actually making more commitments and keeping to its commitments that it made before it left the Paris Agreement. But with the United States back in, it actually creates a much broader group of countries that would be able to address climate change, particularly from the developed world. But within the G7, being all the developed countries, what we will be looking at is the climate finance promises. We'll be looking at the ramping up of green investment and the protecting of biodiversity, particularly in the oceans economy. But in terms of the actual talking points that are key in terms of the G7 this year, we're looking, as I said, around the global vaccine distribution. We are also concerned around climate finance, but also the other side of this is that there is a lot of debt that has been racked up by developing countries to address not only COVID-19, but the historical legacy issues that have been there through development. And the last one would be the fair access to just general finance and technology breakthroughs, particularly with the IP rights. So those 4 particular areas are quite key in terms of the G7 moving forward.
The Paris Agreement, it's been some years now, and there's been accusations that people have just been lethargic. They agreed to it, and they always sit down, agree to things, but actually the doing becomes the hard work. And it seems as if slow progress, if any, has been made since Paris.
Yeah, I mean, the real numbers are telling us that the Paris Agreement, at least its implementation, including the Framework Convention, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, aren't really meeting what needs to happen, right? And part of that is really that the old dispensation around where action needs to happen, where implementation needs to occur, was that the developed world, the G7 in particular, will be acting as the first movers. So they will have to make sure that they cut down their emissions, they bring in the necessary investment, and make sure that the emissions that are around the world are being reduced to a certain rate. But then with the Paris Agreement, everybody took on the responsibility to act. But within that, what then happened, which I think is part of the problem in terms of when do you implement, is that the Paris Agreement entered early before 2020, so it was already enforced before 2020, but none of the rules that allow for implementation were agreed, so the rule book wasn't there, and even the measures and the means in order to monitor and verify the kinds of actions that are there, and also to facilitate the kinds of exchanges that are necessary weren't there. It's only at this particular COP that we'll be able to put the final strokes in terms of the means of implementation and the market mechanisms that would allow for implementation. So actual implementation is only starting as we speak.
And I suppose the people sitting together are the ones that can influence the most what happens is it Edinburgh?
The COP negotiations will be happening in Glasgow this year. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So Boris Johnson seems to be saying the right things, but what will be a win for you when they make a final announcement at the end of their gathering?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of this particular gathering for the G7, really for the UK specifically, would be to restore its own ODA, overseas development aid, to 0.7 of their GDP, while maintaining a climate finance commitment which are extra and additional to the ODA commitments. That is quite key. But really, it would be that the United States ramps up its own contributions in terms of what kinds of funds it will be facilitating. Even Germany, including even Italy, would have to start looking at doubling up their own contributions, whilst also allowing for this bifurcation of having mitigation. So having funds to be able to reduce emissions, but also to be able to adapt to the current impacts that we're feeling. Like, for example, when we had Cyclone Idai and Cyclone Eloise, one after the other, the ability to adapt to that is quite key, and we need the funds to be able to be opened up for such implementation.
Boris Johnson again talking about helping African countries decarbonise a bit more. And I'm in two minds about this, because we're not the biggest polluters. And in fact, most of the ones that are sitting at this table probably need to look in the mirror a little bit first. But at the same time, for sure, we do need to be part of the story. So what kind of help do you think we need?
Yeah, I think the fact that Africa, South Africa, Nigeria, the large economies in Africa are taking quite strong signals in terms of what they're wanting to do in terms of climate change is quite key. But we have to remember that under the Paris Agreement, we all have this responsibility to act, right? What we do need is the means of implementation. And part of that is that we need the funds to be able to reduce our emissions or to stop us from actually having more emissions coming from these hydrocarbons, whether it's gas, coal, or oil. And then the second thing would be that we need access to the technologies that would allow us to not be able to go or not to go into the direction which we're trying to remove ourselves from, right? We don't want to go into the same direction as the G7 in terms of the kinds of energy infrastructures that they have, which is causing climate change. So we need the access to the technologies which are being developed by the very same countries within the G7. And then lastly, we need capacity building so that our institutions, as well as our internal processes, are able to weather as well as understand the kinds of dynamics that are coming out, whether it's in the political sense, the social sense, or in the economic sense, because there will be a lot of funds, there are a lot of funds coming in. However, can we actually use those funds in the manner in which they're supposed to be used and not channel them in the wrong direction, such as building a new coal plant or a new oil refinery?
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, actually, that it must be difficult for President Ramaphosa to go to these conferences and have to have these hard conversations because he's got to keep the lights on at home. And then if you walk around areas like Witbank, the pollution that's there and the damage that's being caused to populations and the environment generally, very difficult stories to ignore.
Yeah, and I mean, not so long ago, and not taking away from what's happening in Witbank, but just not so long ago here in Gauteng, we were able, specifically in Joburg and then the smaller parts of Pretoria, we had the stench, right? We had the particular stench that was blown by the wind from the Mpumalanga region, which was a sense of how sulfur dioxide, as well as the coal infrastructure that we have, is actually polluting. So other cities within South Africa are living with that on a daily basis, and we only got a whiff of it. But when the president left the country here, he didn't actually look at climate as the main thing he's going to be talking about at the G7. It's going to be secondary. The main thing that he's going to be talking about is the vaccine, particularly the waivers of the rights to be able to produce and to manufacture the vaccine internally within other domestic countries outside of the ones that have produced them or had basically invested in the research and development. But with climate, I think there are a number of steps that South Africa are taking, like setting up the Presidential Commission on Climate Change, like looking at ramping up renewables. But there are still a lot of steps that can be taken, particularly around our oceans, particularly around our biodiversity, and also within the domestic sense in terms of the residential area being able to play a role in the mitigation efforts. But there are signals that are coming out from the states that are looking good. But the thing that we are going to see if it's going to be true, that the signals are going to stand for a longer period of time, is what we call the nationally determined contribution. Is that going to communicate that we are effectively leaving behind coal and going through a just transition? And that's going to be key. And hopefully he will be able to communicate that we are leaving coal behind and starting with a just transition towards renewables.
All right. So today is World Oceans Day. And I just wonder how the climate has affected our oceans, because the theme this year is lives and livelihoods. And I guess that the climate has been playing a part in how the oceans are able to help us with our lives and livelihoods.
Yes, indeed. And also the reverse also, or rather the converse also works, right? The oceans are quite key. Most of the carbon sinks, or meaning the absorption ability of the earth to take up the greenhouse gases and the heating effect of the greenhouse gases is actually sitting in the ocean. And the oceans in themselves are also quite exploited. So whether it's undersea mining, whether it's oil drilling, whether it's overfishing and the types of fishing that we have, which are basically trawlers taking up large sectors of biodiversity within the oceans, are actually weakening the ability of the oceans to help us stem off climate change and have this catastrophic ecosystem collapse. But in terms of where we are, the ocean is quite critical, and we're at a stage where we are able to actually make decisions that will lead us into a situation where the biodiversity actually recuperates and the climate is actually more or less saved from what is happening.
All right, and I guess you must be excited that green political parties seem to be gaining momentum. They could be quite influential in countries like Germany even.
Yeah, so we're hoping that we'll also get some in developing countries very soon. You never know. But yeah, it's also a signal that this generation and this particular time in history is looking at a more holistic approach to our livelihoods, and not just economics and not just the social dynamics, but also where we live and how we live, the actual material conditions that we're facing, which is really amazing. It's a good sign.
Happy Kambule, always great talking to you. Let's not wait so long for our next conversation. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right, that's Happy Kambule, who's the Senior Climate and Energy Campaign Manager at Greenpeace Africa, speaking to us ahead of the G7 gathering with the presidents there and what he hopes will come out of there in terms of our environment and climate issues.